Welcome friends to the session on modern Western philosophy. In this session, we discuss Hegelian dialectical method. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Georg Wilhelm Hegel is one of the most influential and systematic philosophers among German idealists. He is well known for his philosophy of history and philosophy of religion. Hegel was in fact greatly prompted into philosophical construction by the speculations of Kant. It is true that he was very much indebted to Aristotle. His was the philosophy of idealism. Kant's doctrine of understanding make the nature directly paved the way for Hegelian idealism. True, Kant meant that the human understanding gives a priority laws to phenomenal nature, but Hegel did away with the distinction of phenomena and noumena. Thus, Kant's teaching was transformed into an idealistic system according to which there is an absolute mind which progressively expresses itself in nature, life and human mind. Kant's teachings have directly and indirectly contributed to the rise of Hegelian idealism through Fichte and Schelling. Hegel was born in Stuttgart, Germany in 1770. He studied theology and philosophy at Tübingen and held private tutorships in Switzerland and Frankfurt from 1794 to 1801. His chief works include the philosophy of mind, the philosophy of right, philosophy of history, phenomenology of mind, lectures on the philosophy of religion, etc. According to Hegel, it is the business of philosophy to know the world of nature and of human experience, to study and comprehend the reason in things, their eternal essence, harmony and law. Things have a meaning. The process in the world is rational. Since reality is at a bottom irrational, a necessary logical process of thoughts or notions, it can be known only by thought. The function of philosophy will be to understand the laws or necessary forms according to which reason operates. In his view, therefore, logic and metaphysics are one and the same. Predecessors of Hegel. The focus of the post-Kantian philosophy was chiefly on the following task: how to bring unity or a common basis for the principles of natural science, moral aesthetics and teleology, what to do with the thing in itself, how to justify the ideas of God, freedom and immortality. It seemed desirable to comprehend in the unity of a system the various tendencies of the age, critical idealism, Spinozism, rationalism, the faith philosophy, etc. The Kantian solution of the controversy between the head and the heart and the idealistic worldview which it vouchsafed became popular in Germany and formed the starting point of what is called post-Kantian idealism, the chief representatives of which are Fichte, Schelling and Hegel. Kant had done a laborious critical examination of scientific, moral and metaphysical knowledge. His successors made the intelligible world or freedom to which the moral law points the starting point of their speculations. For them, the ideal or supersensible world, the world of mind or spirit, is the real world. With this self-determining spiritual activity as the principle, they seek to solve all the problems of philosophy, to account for knowledge and experience, to explain nature, history and human institutions. According to them, the ideal principle brings unity into our knowledge, integrates the categories, unifies the theoretical and practical reason, enables us to overcome the dualism between mechanism and teleology, and removes the inconsistencies in the Kantian thing in itself. If to know means to comprehend the active, living, synthetic, spiritual process of reality, a method that limits itself to phenomena cannot be knowledge. On this point, Fichte, Schelling, Schleiermacher and Hegel are agreed. They also agree in their conception of reality and in the organic and historical view of things which Lessing, Herder, Winckelmann and Goethe taught. Among the post-Kantian line of thinkers, Fichte, Schelling and Schleiermacher come to be the immediate predecessors of Hegel. Fichte. Fichte's basal insight is concept of freedom. He held that the ego is a free self-determining activity. It is the principle of life and mind of knowledge and conduct. It is the ground on which knowledge rests, the unifying principle of the theoretical understanding. He bases all reality on the ego. Since ego is everything, there can be nothing outside of it, nothing in itself in the sense of an independent extramental object. Fichet means by ego not the individualized ego of common sense, but the pure ego, pure activity, universal reason as such. Fichet is an absolute idealist since he assumes a universal principle of reality, but he refuses to conceive this principle as a static substance. It is a living, flowing, self-determining spiritual process that expresses or manifests itself in individual selves. In it, we live and move and have our being. He does not deny the existence of an extramental world. However, his realism is asserted within the framework of absolute idealism. We are the products or revelations of universal nature. Consistent with the new idealism, he conceives existence as a dynamic process of evolution guided by a moral purpose. Schelling was drawn to the new idealism of Fichet. However, he was not satisfied with his original conception of nature as a product of absolute ego. Schelling broadens the concept of spirit, mind or reason so as to include the unconscious instinctive purposive force that manifests itself in organic and inorganic nature. The ideal and the real, thought and being are identical in their root. The absolute unfolds itself, it has a history, it is an evolutionary process, the highest goal of which is the self-consciousness, that is, the reality is an organic whole of interrelated parts. Friedrich Schleiermacher. In Schleiermacher, deep religious feeling is combined with marked intellectual capacity. For him, God and the world are one, but the world has a relative independent existence. God has never been without a world, nor the world apart from God. Yet, it must distinguish the idea of God and the idea of the world. The absolute is conceived organically as unity in diversity as the identity of thought and being. The relation of the individual to the absolute is conceived in a way to preserve some measure of freedom and independence for individual. The absolute unity or identity of thought and being, which we cannot define in conceptual terms, is immediately experienced in self-consciousness. Both Fichet and Schelling had proceeded from Kantian presuppositions. Mind is the principle of knowledge. All philosophy is ultimately a philosophy of mind. Both accepted the dynamic view of reality. For both, the ideal principle is an active living process. In Schelling, nature assumes an important place in thinking. Hegel builds on the foundations laid by Fichet and Schelling. He agrees with former in insisting on logical method, with the latter in identifying logic with metaphysics. With both, he agrees in conceiving reality as a living, developing process. Hegel holds that there is a logic in nature as well as history, and the universe at bottom is a logical system. Hegelian absolute is not an undifferentiated absolute as Schelling had taught, but it is a subject, which means that it is life, process, evolution as well as consciousness and knowledge. The goal towards which the developing absolute moves is self-consciousness. Hegel's most important ideas were formed in response to a number of issues in philosophy, which was often in response to historical events. He held that what appeared to be contraries in philosophy, such as mind-body, freedom determinism, idealism, materialism, universal particular, the state, the individual, or even God-man, appeared such incompatible alternatives only because of the incomplete perspectives within which the opposition were formulated. In Germany, Hegel has continued to influence a number of different schools of new Marxism, especially the Frankfurt School or critical theory group. He has been extremely influential in France. Hegelian themes continue to resurface in contemporary hermeneutics, in communitarism, in ethics, and in the increasing attention given to conceptual change and history in the philosophy of science. This has meant for many that Hegel should be regarded as a potential contributor to many new approaches to philosophy. The dialectical method. It may be said that if the task of philosophy is to understand the nature of things, to tell us about the reality, the purpose of things, etc., then its method must be suited to its end. The method should be the course of evolving reason in the world. According to Hegel, we cannot exhaust reality by abstract concepts. Here, which differs from the intuitions of Schelling or the conceptual knowledge of Kant. The reason for this is based on Hegel's metaphysical considerations. For him, reality is a moving dynamic process, a dialectical process which abstract concepts cannot faithfully represent. The limitation of abstract thinking is that it takes the existing things in isolation. The intellect can only distinguish, oppose and relate things. The activity which sees things whole or unifies the opposites is a higher function of mind. Hegel called this method the dialectical method. Hegel conceives philosophy as science, by which he meant scientific knowledge. Truth exists for him only as a system, the system of pure reason. This is made possible only by its characteristic method, which it cannot borrow either from positive science or from mathematics. In Hegelian view, dialectical method is the proper method of philosophy. It is determined by the subject matter of philosophy itself. In fact, it is the inner self movement of the philosophical content. It is a truism that the progress of the method at the same time determines the progress of the subject matter itself. Dialectical method is not something which is to be externally applied. It constitutes the moving soul of scientific procedure. It is the principle whereby the inner correction and necessity in the content of philosophy is made possible and evident. However, the method depends on a certain logical position with which ordinary understanding is rather unfamiliar. The dialectical method has to be interpreted as a philosophical method to explain a dynamic and evolving world according to some rational plan. The dialectical method tries to explain this world of change and evolution in terms of unchangeable ideas. Hegel would explain the logical transition from the absolute to the concrete, from the more general to the less general idea. The nerve of the dialectical process is that logical advancement can be read off from empirical events, but the dialectical steps do not become empirical on that account. Empirical events are merely illustrative guide of the dialectic advance. According to Hegel, the conception of intuitive thought is different from, is equally present in Aristotle, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, etc. But none of these thinkers had clearly grasped either the general nature of intuition or its relation to discussion within the nature of thought itself. Aristotle's is a rational institution. Descartes' intuition is clear and distinct apprehension. Hegel's conception of thought as intuitive is an effort to expand Aristotle's rational intuition. In Aristotle and Descartes, intuition tends to be wholly severed from discussion. It seems to present with a number of self-evident truths whose connection with the consequences supposed to follow from them thus becomes inexplicable. Here comes a dilemma. Either inference is a tautologis petito principii, or it is an inconsequent leap to a fresh intuition. In fact, Hegel's conception of thought as dialectical is an attempt to solve this dilemma. This movement is to show that it arises from conceiving two moments of a unity in abstract separation. Thought is intuitive, but so far merely immediate. It is discursive, but this discursus is its own activity of self-mediation. Moreover, this mediation is a self-development towards new immediacy, which mediation enriches a progress and yet a return upon itself. This whole activity, verbally expressed as if it were three temporally successive phases, is real only in the union of the first and second moment in the third. In short, Hegel regards thought as dialectical because it is the essential and truest form of that activity which is the essential nature of spirit self-constant in human experience. But we can best understand the immense reconstruction of familiar ways of thinking which the dialectical method involves if we follow tradition and to a large extent Hegel himself by treating it in a more or less familiar terminology. The principle of Hegel's dialectic in its formal and prima facie most prominent shape is the synthesis of opposites. It is a truism that all the early Greek thinkers, as if, says Aristotle, compelled by truth itself, had recognized the importance of opposites in the constitution of the universe. Aristotle himself had the conception of form and matter. According to this view, every finite concept contains in its womb its own opposite, so that if we assert the first, we are required to assert the second, its opposite also. But we cannot rest in sheer oppositions, but are led on to a third position which overcomes the opposition and reconciles the opposed concepts as elements in a higher concept. The dialectical process. Hegel distinguishes three moments of stages in dialectical process. It begins with an abstract universal concept or thesis. This concept gives rise to a contradiction or antithesis. The contradictory concepts are reconciled in a third concept, which therefore is a union of the other two syntheses. The thesis and the antithesis of not cancel each other, but are preserved and amended in the synthesis. So far, whatever concept we begin with is given as immediate and taken in an isolated fashion, but the inherent dialectic makes the distinction evident, which is latent in the concept, and we are led into its other, which is required to define the distinction. The other or the second concept is thus immediately given. We thus see that the immediate becomes mediate, but immediate is not lost in the mediate. We have to return to the immediate, which now takes the form of mediate immediate, which is the characteristic of genuine thought at every stage. Neither the immediate nor the mediate gives us the truth, and nowhere is either available by itself. Abstract thought is apt to take immediacy and immediacy as opposed and irreconcilable characters. In Hegel's opinion, concrete thought, with which alone philosophy is concerned, presents a fluid aspect and is characterized by both immediacy and immediacy at the same time. We thus find thesis running into antithesis and both appearing as inseparable moments in synthesis, which presents their truth in a more adequate form. The dialectical method thus affects a synthesis of opposites. This does not mean that opposition is not recognized as opposition, but only that the opposed elements are shown to be parts of a higher unity which realizes itself through them. The dialectical method asserts that by a negative judgment we reach a higher concept, which because of the negation is richer than the original one. Hegel says, every negation is a new determination. When an affirmation is met by a negation, we are confronted with a contradiction. This second negation does not merely restore the original position, but gives us the original position as enriched by the double negation. The negative self-relation of the concept is the most important point in the dialectic. The concept goes out of itself and becomes its own other, that is first negation, but it also overcomes the opposition and returns to itself, the second negation. The result of the dialectic movement is the truth, which is self-identical whole, while the earlier moments are all abstract. The first synthesis, though positive, is not fully concrete, and the contradiction of the opposite is not wholly removed. And so, the synthesis in its turn becomes a new thesis, which is opposed by its proper antithesis, and these are again reconciled in a new synthesis which transcends them both and retains the truth which was in them. This triadic dialectical process continues until a fully concrete synthesis is reached, in which contradiction is finally dissolved and which therefore does not lead to any further opposition. The final synthesis is the fully adequate definition of absolute. To understand the dialectic method more clearly, we have to reflect upon the first triad of being, non-being, becoming. The dialectic advance traces logical transitions from the abstract to the concrete. Being is most abstract. It is abstract from all determinations. Beyond being itself, it has no other qualities. In comparison with being, becoming is more concrete, since it includes both being and non-being itself. But becoming, in comparison with other succeeding categories, is abstract. Becoming simply means a process without being any specific process. It is bare change which has to be negatively described, that it is not mechanical, nor chemical, nor organic, nor any such special kind of change. Naturally, it has to grow more specific. As the dialectic advances, the succeeding categories become more and more concrete till we reach the absolute, which is the fullest, richest and the most concrete of all the categories. In the last or the highest category, all the previous categories are preserved and nothing is lost. But the reverse is also true. The lower category also contains the higher. With a view to elucidating this paradoxical position, one can say the higher categories contain the lower explicitly, but the lower categories also contain the higher implicitly. Thus, the first category is also the last, and the last contains the first and all other previous categories quite explicitly. What is essential for the science of logic is not so much that a pure immediate is the beginning, but that itself in its totality forms a cycle returning upon itself, wherein the first is also the last and the last first. For example, in a drama, the first scene contains the last scene and the last scene contains the meaning of the first and all other scenes. That the last is also the first category is very important for the Hegelian philosophy. It forms the very nerve of the logical idealism of Hegel. To illustrate the dialectical method with a concrete example, let us go back to the early Greek metaphysics. Parmenides held that being is permanent, Heraclitus that it is constant change, the atomist that it is neither and both, that something is permanent and something changes. However, the new concepts suggest new problems and contradictions which in their turn must be resolved in other concepts. So, the dialectical process which seeks to follow the evolution of reality continues until we reach an ultimate concept notion in which all oppositions are resolved and preserved. But no single concept, not even the highest, represents the whole truth. All concepts are only partial truths. Truth or knowledge is constituted by the entire system of concepts, every one of which has evolved from a basal concept. Truth, like rational reality itself, is a living logical process. The dialectical movement is the logical self-unfolding of thought. Hegel speaks as though thoughts or notions think themselves. There is an inner necessity in them. They are like a growing organism that unfolds its capacities and becomes a concrete organized whole, a concrete universal. Hence, according to Hegel, all the thinker has to do is to let his thought follow its logical course in the manner described. Since this process, if correctly carried on, is identical with the world process, it will be a reproduction of the development immanent in things. To express the movement from thesis through antithesis to synthesis, Hegel uses the word aufheben. Among the ordinary meanings are 1 to cancel or annul and 2 to preserve. Hegel uses it to mean both together. The thesis is cancelled as such by the antithesis, but preserved with the antithesis in the synthesis. It has been objected to Hegel's logic that he bases it on a flat denial of the law of contradiction. But it is a truism that the dialectical triad does not violate the law of contradiction. The antithesis is not just the negation of the thesis, it is the negated thesis. In the dialectical triad, there is no violation of the law because the opposites are not on the same level. The both thesis and antithesis claim to characterize the absolute as a whole. They are not, in fact, competing for the same position. Nothing is lost or gained through dialectical process, but whatever is gained is preserved and enriched. The dialectic moves as it were both forward and backward. At every new stage, we get a new concept, but it is related back to the old. It thus both widens and deepens our knowledge. Karl Marx employed Hegel's dialectical method to generate an internal critique of the theory and practice of capitalism. He wanted to show that under assumptions found in such earlier theorists as Adam Smith, this system must undergo increasingly severe crisis, resulting in the eventual seizure of control of increasingly centralized means of production from the relatively small class of capitalist proprietors by the previously impoverished non-owners in the interest of a thenceforth classless society. Now let us summarize. Dialectic method is in fact an argumentative exchange involving contradiction or a technique connected with such exchanges. The term dialectic means to argue or converse, which is of Greek origin. But the Greek thinkers like Aristotle used it in a more or less logical sense, whereas Hegel transformed the notion into a metaphysical one. He explained dialectical method in terms of the historical processes within the development of spirit. Intellectual thinking or abstract thinking cannot see things wholly and it fails to unify the opposites, but it is only the higher function of the mind. Dialectical process which can know reality or truth as a whole. Truth exists only as a system which the method of dialectics can only seek. The dialectical method tries to explain this world of change and evolution. In its simplest form, it is the synthesis of opposites. The method asserts that by a negative judgment, we reach a higher concept. Every negation is a new determination. The opposed or the negated elements are shown to be part of a higher unity which realizes itself through them. Thus, dialectical method helps us to know the truth and also widens our knowledge. There are some assignments for you to work out. Number 1. Give an account of the different dimensions of the dialectical method in philosophy. 2. Compare and contrast between Hegelian and Marxian dialectics. 3. Examine how Hegel improves upon the principle of opposition prevalent in Greek philosophies. 4. Examine the pragmatic significance of the statement, every negation is a new determination. 5. Bring out the salient features of Hegelian logic. I suggest some books for your reference. 1. Copleston Friedrich S.J., A History of Philosophy, New York Image Books, 1965. 2. Tilly Frank, History of Philosophy, Allahabad, Central Publishing, 1992. 3. Valence Wilhelm, Prolegomena to the Study of Hegel's Philosophy, Oxford Clarendon Press, 1984. 4. Stephen John Wright, A History of Modern Philosophy, New York, Macmillan, 1964. 5. Mashi Y, A Critical History of Western Philosophy, New Delhi, Motilal, 1994. Hope that you have enjoyed this session. See you next time. Until then, bye.